They called him a madman, an ordinary soldier, no engineering degree, no orders to change the course of war. But in the hell of Normandy, where molten steel and human blood became one, he created a weapon so simple no one could believe it, and it turned the tide of D-Day. An invention never written in textbooks, an idea once laughed at, and a mechanic who dared to defy every rule of war. Without him, the greatest invasion of the century might have ended in flames. This is the forgotten story of Sergeant Curtis Culin, the man who turned German scrap into the Allies' salvation. And it all began with a burned-out tank on the beaches of Normandy. The wind howled across Normandy. It was cold, violent, and thick with the smell of salt, gunpowder, and burning oil. The sea was no longer blue, it had turned the colour of blood. June 6, 1944. The day when freedom landed upon the beaches under the shadow of death. Explosions tore through the sand, turning the air into fire. The ground shook beneath the boots of men who barely had the strength to run. Bullets hissed like hornets, cutting down soldiers before they could even scream. The waves carried bodies and helmets ashore in a grim tide. Every step forward felt like walking through a storm of steel. Every breath was borrowed from the dying. The sky hung heavy with smoke. Landing craft burned offshore, their hulls split open like carcasses. Amid the chaos, a Sherman tank rolled off its ramp and into the surf. Its name, stenciled in white on the turret, was Fury. Inside, the crew shouted over the roar of the engine and the pounding of artillery. "Keep moving!" their commander yelled. A shell screamed down from the cliffs and struck home. The blast lifted the tank off the ground. When the smoke cleared, Fury was burning. The hatch burst open. Flames poured out. One by one, the men scrambled free or didn't. From the wreck crawled Sergeant Curtis Culin, coughing through the smoke, his uniform blackened and torn. He was a mechanic from New Jersey, not a hero from any poster. Before the war, he fixed delivery trucks and welded frames in greasy workshops. Now, he found himself crawling through fire and mud, watching everything he knew about war burn to ash. He could have died there, and no one would have remembered his name. But something inside him refused to die. Something sparked the kind of spark that doesn't fade when the fire does. D-Day was supposed to be unstoppable. The Allies had planned it for years, assembling the might of nations to crush Hitler's fortress. But after the beaches were taken, the momentum faltered. The Germans had turned the countryside into a maze of traps and invisible walls. Those walls were hedgerows, ancient embankments of earth, roots, and stone, built by Norman farmers centuries before America was even born. They divided the land into small squares, each bordered by thick green walls taller than a man. To the farmers, they were boundaries. To the soldiers, they were death. From the air, Normandy looked like a checkerboard of green. On the ground, it was a labyrinth. Every hedgerow hid an ambush. German snipers lay behind them. Machine guns waited in silence. Anti-tank teams crouched with Panzerfausts ready to strike. For Allied tank crews, it was hell. The Sherman, fast, agile, dependable, had no answer for the hedgerows. Each time a tank tried to climb, its nose rose, its belly lifted, and for a split second, it became a perfect target, and the Germans never missed. Day after day, the same tragedy repeated. A Sherman crept forward. It hit the wall. The driver gunned the engine, desperate to climb. Then the flash, the impact, the fireball. When the flames cleared, all that remained were twisted tracks and silence. The men began to call them the green walls of death. The hedgerows didn't just stop tanks, they stopped hope. Commanders tore up maps, cursing. Infantry huddled in the fields, terrified to move. Each advance cost dozens of lives for a few yards of dirt. They could see the church steeples of the next village, sometimes only a mile away, but that mile might as well have been 1,000. Cullen watched it all. He saw tanks die one after another, their crews screaming inside as fire consumed them. He saw medics dragging half-burned men from the wrecks. He saw the exhaustion in the eyes of officers who had run out of ideas. War had become a nightmare of repetition. The enemy was not always the German soldier, it was the land itself. 6 days after the landings, the advance had ground to a halt. The beaches were secure, but the heart of France was still beyond reach. The fields of Normandy were supposed to be the gateway to Europe. Instead, they were a graveyard of steel. At night, the sounds of war never stopped. The crack of rifles, the distant thud of artillery, and the mournful rumble of engines that would never start again. Smoke hung low over the fields, mixing with the mist, and through that grey silence, Culin walked, his boots sinking into the mud, his hands black with grease and grief. He was not a man of speeches. He was not a strategist, but he had a mechanic's gift, the ability to see not what is, but what could be fixed. While others cursed the hedgerows, he studied them, crawled up to them, scraped the soil with his hands, felt the roots like cables of iron. The problem wasn't bravery. It wasn't even tactics. It was simple physics. The tanks couldn't climb the walls because they were built to roll, not dig. The idea came to him like lightning. He was walking past the remains of a German beach obstacle, a Czech hedgehog, a tangle of heavy steel beams the enemy had planted in the sand to rip apart landing craft. Now it lay broken, half buried in the mud, useless. But Culin saw something in it that no one else did. Those jagged edges, those teeth of iron could rip through more than boats. They could tear through the earth itself. That night, he couldn't sleep. He sat by a small fire, turning a rusted bolt in his hands. Somewhere out there, men were dying because no one could think of a better way. He was no general, but maybe, just maybe, he could build one. The next morning, he marched into his commanding officer's tent, eyes burning with conviction. "Captain Morrison," he said, "I've got an idea." The captain didn't look up from his maps. "Everyone's got ideas, Culin. Most of them get people killed. This one won't, not if we do it right." Morrison sighed. "Let me guess, another plan to blow up the hedgerows?" "No, sir. I don't want to blow them up." Culin leaned forward. "I want to go through them." The captain frowned. "Through them?" "Yes, sir. The tanks can't climb the walls, but they can push. If we weld these German obstacles to the front sharp, angled, they'll cut through the earth instead of getting stuck on it." Morrison stared, half amused, half incredulous. "You want to weld scrap metal onto a Sherman?" Culin grinned. "I want to turn a tank into a plow." There was a long pause. Then the captain chuckled. "You're out of your damn mind." "Probably," Culin said. "But if it works, it'll get us out of this field." Morrison's smile faded. He saw something in Cullen's eyes, not madness, but certainty. He nodded slowly. "All right, Sergeant. You've got 48 hours and one tank. Make your miracle." "Yes, sir." Cullen saluted and left the tent. The decision had been made. Now it was time to build hope out of scrap. That night, the camp came alive with the sound of welding torches. Sparks flew like fireflies in the dark. Men hauled twisted steel from the beach and hammered it into shape. Cullen worked without rest, sleeves rolled, face blackened, eyes bright with purpose. When the dawn came, a new creature stood among them, a Sherman tank reborn, its nose armoured with jagged teeth of steel, ugly, raw, and powerful. The men laughed when they saw it. "Looks like a damn rhinoceros," one said. Cullen wiped the sweat from his face. "Good," he replied. "Let's see if it charges." The camp slept in uneasy silence, broken only by the low cough of engines and the occasional crack of distant artillery. Somewhere beyond the fields, the Germans were regrouping, confident the hedgerows would hold another day. But in one corner of the Allied line, a different kind of war was being fought, one of sparks, steel, and imagination. Sergeant Curtis Culin crouched beside the half-disassembled Sherman, his face ghostly in the welding glow. Around him, 3 volunteers hauled fragments of twisted German beach obstacles from a truck bed. The steel screeched across the mud. Every clang echoed like defiance against the night. "Cut here," Culin ordered, pointing with the torch. "Angle it 30 degrees, it needs to bite, not slide." Private Harris hesitated. "Sir, are we sure this isn't crazy?" Cullen smiled beneath the sweat and grime. "Son, everything in this war is crazy. The question is, does it work?" They worked through the dark. Sparks rained across their boots, painting the walls of the repair tent with bursts of orange light. Each weld was a heartbeat, each hiss of gas another promise that maybe, just maybe, the next day would be different. Outside, soldiers passed and stared. "What the hell are they building?" one whispered. "Looks like a monster," another snorted. "Probably is. The sergeant's gone mad." Cullen heard, but didn't care. He wiped his forehead, squinted at the glowing seam, and struck another arc. "Madness," he muttered, "is just the name they give to the things that work later." By dawn, the skeleton of the device had taken shape, 3 heavy steel prongs welded to the Sherman's lower glacis, angled outward like tusks. Rough, ugly, but strong. The metal still shimmered from heat. Cullen circled it, tapping the joints with a wrench, listening to the ring of good welds. Captain Morrison appeared, coffee mug in hand, eyes bleary. "Jesus! Cullen, what have you done to my tank?" Cullen straightened. "Improved it. It looks like it wants to eat something." "That's the idea." The captain set his mug down and walked closer, fingertips tracing the crude edges. "You think this'll really punch through those walls?" "I don't think," Cullen said. "I know metal, and this'll dig like a plow through soil." Morrison exhaled. "You've got nerve, I'll give you that." He paused, then added quietly, "Let's hope your nerves are contagious." That afternoon, they rolled the Sherman out into the open field. Mud clung to its tracks. The morning fog had not yet lifted. Word had spread, and a small crowd gathered to watch. Soldiers stood on ammunition crates, engineers jotted in notebooks, even a few correspondents lingered near the edge, cameras ready. Cullen climbed onto the turret and addressed no one in particular. "All right," he said, voice hoarse. "Let's see if this thing has teeth." He dropped into the driver's seat. Inside, the metal smelled of oil and burnt air. His gloves stuck slightly to the controls. The gunner, a kid barely 20, whispered, "If this goes wrong, you owe me a beer." "If this goes wrong," Cullen replied, "you won't need one." The engine coughed, then thundered to life. The tank lurched forward, tracks grinding through the muck. Ahead, 50 feet away, stood a hedgerow 12 feet high, ancient, defiant. The men watching fell silent. Cullen tightened his jaw. "All right, sweetheart, let's show them." The rhinoceros, though no one had named it yet, gathered speed. The ground trembled. The impact came like the world splitting in two, a roar of metal and earth, roots ripping apart, dirt exploding skyward. For a moment, the tank disappeared in the cloud. Then, out the other side, it burst through trailing mud, alive, unstoppable. Inside, the crew stared at each other in disbelief. "We're through," the driver whispered. "Holy hell, we're through!" Outside, cheers erupted. Men shouted, waved helmets, slapped backs. The impossible had just happened before their eyes. Cullen climbed out through the hatch, chest heaving, smoke clinging to his uniform. Captain Morrison approached, mouth half open, as though words couldn't keep up. "I'll be damned," he said. "It actually works." Cullen just nodded, a tired smile tugging at his lips. "Told you, all it needed was teeth." That night, under a canopy of fading stars, the camp hummed with energy again. Officers from nearby regiments came to inspect the modified tank. Engineers measured angles, sketched diagrams by lantern light, took notes on welding seams. A jeep roared off toward headquarters carrying the first report. By morning, the message had reached General Omar Bradley. His response was swift and decisive. "Replicate the design. Field test immediately." Word spread like wildfire. Every mechanic with access to a welder was suddenly a part of Cullen's revolution. Scrap metal vanished from supply piles. Sparks filled the night air across Normandy. Within 24 hours, entire platoons of Shermans were bristling with steel tusks. Cullen stood beside his creation, watching the activity, a strange mix of pride and dread stirring inside him. "They're calling it the rhinoceros," Morrison said, stepping up beside him. Cullen chuckled softly. "Could be worse. At least rhinos charge." Morrison looked at him for a long moment. "Tomorrow, they'll want you to lead the assault with it." Cullen nodded slowly. Figures. If you build the monster, you ride it. The captain placed a hand on his shoulder. You've done something no one else could, Curtis. Whatever happens tomorrow, you've already changed the war. Culin didn't answer. He looked out at the horizon, the same horizon that had swallowed so many friends, and thought of the men who'd burned in their tanks, the hedgerows that had laughed at them. He whispered to himself, almost as a prayer, "Let this damn thing work." The rhinoceros loomed behind him, its metal glistening in the pale moonlight, crude, scarred, magnificent. Tomorrow, it would face its first real enemy. The dawn came pale and cold, the kind of light that seemed to drain the colour from everything it touched. Mist drifted low across the fields, blurring the line between earth and sky. Somewhere beyond the fog, artillery murmured like distant thunder. Normandy was waking again, restless, broken, waiting. The rhinoceros stood silent in the half-light, its steel tusks gleaming faintly with dew. It looked almost alive. Around it, men moved in hushed voices, checking the engine, tightening bolts, loading shells. The air carried that electric stillness before battle when fear and focus become one. Culin climbed onto the hull, gloved hands brushing against the cold steel. He felt the weight of what was coming, not just for him, but for every man who'd died, because those green walls refused to fall. He'd built this thing with hope, now it had to earn its name. Captain Morrison approached through the mist. "Command approved the test," he said quietly. "You'll lead the column. If you make it through, we go wide, full assault." Culin nodded, the corners of his mouth tightening. "And if we don't?" Morrison lit a cigarette, exhaled slowly. "Then we'll be scraping you off the hedges. Either way, we'll know." They shared a small laugh, the kind that men only allow themselves before the unthinkable. Then Morrison's face hardened. "Bring them home, Curtis." Culin climbed into the tank. The hatch sealed above him with a metallic clank that cut him off from the world outside. Inside was dim, cramped, hot already from the engine's idle rumble. He could smell the grease, the fuel, the tension. The driver glanced at him. "You ready, Sarge?" "No," Culin said. "But the tank is." The engine roared, and the rhinoceros lurched forward, tracks biting deep into the mud. Outside, the mist parted just enough to reveal the first wall, 12 feet high, green and ancient, a monster of dirt and roots. 200 yards, the gunner called out. Culin adjusted his headset. "Steady, don't slow for anything." The Germans were out there, hidden behind that green curtain, waiting like spiders in their webs. They'd killed dozens of Shermans in this same field. They'd never faced one like this. At 100 yards, the first muzzle flashes appeared. German 88 seconds fired from behind the trees, their shells slicing through the fog. One round hit close, a burst of fire and dirt that rattled the hull. Another whistled overhead, missing by a miracle. "Keep going," Culin barked. 50 yards. The tank's treads tore through the wet soil, engine screaming. 10 yards. Culin braced himself. "Now." The rhinoceros slammed into the hedgerow with the full weight of 20 tons of steel. The sound was deafening, metal against earth, roots snapping like bones, mud exploding in every direction. For a heartbeat, the tank seemed to vanish into the wall, swallowed whole. Then came the crack, deep and final. The hedgerow split open. The rhinoceros burst through, roaring into open ground on the other side. Sunlight flashed across its hull. The crew erupted in disbelief. "We made it!" the driver shouted. "We're through!" Outside, the soldiers watching cheered like madmen. Helmets flew into the air. The impossible had just become real. Culin didn't celebrate. His eyes were locked on the field ahead, wide, open, free. For the first time since D-Day, the Earth itself wasn't the enemy. Over the radio, Captain Morrison's voice came through, half breathless. "Culin, you magnificent bastard. You actually did it." The crew laughed, shouted, slapped the sides of the hull. The rhinoceros had done what thousands of men and machines could not. Within hours, word raced through the Allied lines. Officers arrived by jeep, notebooks in hand, cameras flashing. Engineers swarmed around the tank, tracing every weld, sketching every angle. Even the skeptical ones couldn't hide their awe. That evening, under a canopy of smoke-stained sky, a coded message left headquarters. It was addressed to General Omar Bradley. By dawn, the reply came back clear and direct. Replicate Cullen's design. Immediate production. 5,000 cutters ordered for Sherman units across Normandy. 5,000. The welders worked through the night. The sound of torches filled the dark, echoing across the fields like a chorus of hissing serpents. Sparks lit up the camps as mechanics turned junk into salvation. Tanks that had once died on the hedgerows were being reborn, fanged, fierce, ready to tear the land apart. Cullen stood by his rhinoceros, staring at the glowing horizon. The air smelled of hot metal and possibility. Around him, soldiers passed, whispering his name like a rumor. He didn't look at them. He was staring into the dark, past the smoke, past the victory. He knew what came next. Ideas were one thing, war was another. Soon they'd take the rhinoceros into real combat, real guns, real death. He ran a hand along the rough weld seams, feeling the small imperfections beneath his fingertips. He thought of the men who had burned inside their tanks, the ones this machine might have saved, if only it had existed sooner. Morrison found him there, alone with the tank. "You should get some sleep," he said. Cullen shook his head. "Can't. The tank's ready. I need to be too." The captain hesitated. "You realize if this goes wrong, it's on you." Cullen looked up, his expression unreadable. "If it goes right, it's on everyone." Morrison smiled faintly. "You're a stubborn bastard, Cullen." "Maybe, but sometimes stubborn saves lives." The captain left him with that, and Cullen stayed by the machine until dawn. When the sun rose, the rhinoceros gleamed silver and scarred in the new light, a beast born of desperation and brilliance. In a few hours, it would go to war. The morning of the assault came heavy with silence, the kind of silence that only exists before the storm. The hedgerows ahead looked harmless, a green patchwork of leaves and shadows, glistening with dew under the sun. But every man in Cullen's crew knew what hid behind them. Death. "Engines on," Cullen said quietly, his voice steady but low. The roar of the rhinoceros's motor shattered the calm. Across the line, dozens of Shermans followed, each with their own welded teeth, each carrying a piece of Cullen's madness and hope. Infantry crouched behind them, rifles ready. Officers bent over maps one last time. Radios crackled. Overhead, the distant hum of P-47 Thunderbolts circled like hawks. Cullen pulled his goggles down. The world became a frame of smoke and sunlight. "Let's get this done," he muttered. The column rolled forward. At first, nothing moved on the German side. The hedgerows stood quiet, green and innocent. Then came the scream of the first 88mm shell. It struck short, exploding in a shower of dirt and flame. A second shell hit closer, too close. The ground shook beneath the rhinoceros. "Keep going," Cullen shouted over the radio. "Do not stop." The tank lunged ahead. Bullets pattered against the armor like rain. The machine gunner fired blindly into the greenery. Then the impact. The rhinoceros hit the hedgerow at full speed. The steel prongs dug deep, the earth convulsed, and with a thunderous crack, the wall shattered. The tank burst through, mud and roots flying. "Through! We're through!" the driver yelled. Behind them, the other Shermans followed, their blades tearing through the hedgerows one by one. The entire front line erupted in motion. Soldiers charged through the openings, shouting, firing, climbing over the smoking wrecks. For the first time in weeks, the Allies were no longer trapped. The land that had swallowed so many lives was finally breaking. The Germans, stunned, fired wildly. Machine guns clattered, mortars hissed, but the momentum had shifted. Cullen's tank ploughed forward like a living creature, its steel tusks glinting in the chaos. "Enemy armor!" someone screamed. Cullen's eyes snapped to the horizon. There, a Panther tank, sleek, black, monstrous, emerging from behind the trees. Its gun turned toward them like a predator fixing its prey. "Panzer! Front!" the gunner yelled. Cullen's pulse hammered. "Range?" 600 meters. Load armor-piercing. The loader slammed the shell into the breech. The Panther fired first. The German round shrieked past, missing by inches. The concussion rocked the tank. Fire! The rhinoceros's cannon thundered. The shell struck the Panther's lower hull. Sparks and flame erupted. The German tank shuddered, smoke pouring from its vents. "We got him!" the loader shouted. The Panther fired again, a last desperate shot, but it sailed high, harmless. Then the tank's hatch burst open, its crew spilling out into the smoke, their black uniforms catching fire as they ran. Inside the rhinoceros, no one spoke for a long moment. Then laughter, ragged, disbelieving, alive, filled the cramped metal shell. "Holy hell," the driver said. "We actually beat a Panther." Cullen smiled faintly. "We didn't beat it," he said. "We outthought it." By afternoon, the line had broken wide open. What had once been weeks of stalemate turned into hours of momentum. The Allies surged forward, field by field, hedge by hedge. Infantrymen poured through the breaches carved by Cullen's cutters. Machine guns went silent. German positions collapsed. When the sun began to set, the smoke turned the sky red. The sound of engines replaced the sound of fear. For the first time since the invasion, the soldiers were advancing faster than the medics. From his hatch, Cullen looked across the battlefield, the open fields of Normandy rolling free for the first time. Wrecked tanks, burning hedgerows, craters, and through it all, the unmistakable tracks of progress. Captain Morrison's voice crackled over the radio. "Cullen, report." "Still moving," Cullen replied. "You realize what you just did?" Cullen wiped the sweat from his brow. "I just drove straight through history, sir. When night fell, the tanks stopped to refuel. The rhinoceros's prongs were bent and caked with mud, its armor dented, its paint blackened by smoke." Cullen climbed down and leaned against the hull, too tired to speak. The field was eerily quiet. In the distance, fires burned where the hedgerows once stood. Soldiers laughed softly around small campfires. A few sang. Some cried. No one talked about fear anymore. Morrison walked over, carrying 2 tin cups of coffee. He handed one to Cullen. "They're calling you the mad mechanic," he said. Cullen smirked. "Could be worse. They could call me the dead mechanic." The captain laughed. "Bradley's already sent word. The design's going to every tank unit in Normandy. They'll all have cutters by the end of the week." Cullen stared into his cup, the dark liquid trembling in the light of the flames. "Then it worked." "It did more than work," Morrison said. "It saved lives." "Thousands, maybe." For a moment, neither man spoke. The fire crackled. Somewhere in the dark, a distant shell exploded, a reminder that the war wasn't over yet. Cullen finally said, quietly, "Funny thing about machines. You build them to save lives, but they always end up taking some, too." Morrison looked at him. "That's not on you, Sergeant. That's the war." Cullen nodded, but didn't answer. He looked up at the stars, faint, hidden behind the smoke, and thought of home. Of the garage in New Jersey, the smell of oil and rain, of the simplicity of engines that didn't kill. He closed his eyes. For the first time in days, he allowed himself to feel it: pride, sorrow, exhaustion, all tangled together. The rhinoceros sat beside him, silent, steam rising from its armor like breath. It had become more than a tank. It was a symbol. Proof that even in hell, one spark of human ingenuity could turn despair into progress. As dawn crept over Normandy once more, the first light glinted off the steel teeth of Cullen's creation. The hedgerows, once the walls of death, were nothing but scars on the earth. And the war, for the first time, was moving again. By August 1944, the rhinoceros was no longer an experiment, it was a revolution. Thousands of Shermans rolled through France, each one carrying Cullen's steel teeth. What had started as one man's midnight madness became the beating heart of an army on the move. The hedgerows that once stopped the Allies were gone, crushed under treads and smoke. Villages, once hidden behind walls of green, were liberated one after another. Columns of tanks surged across the countryside, through the ruins of Caen, past Falaise, toward the Seine. When they finally crossed the Rhine months later, the rhinoceros was still there, charging through every obstacle between Normandy and Berlin. But for Curtis Culin, victory came with an ache he couldn't shake. Each time he saw the steel cutters welded to a tank, he remembered the faces of the men who'd never seen them. The ones who had burned in those fields before the idea existed, the ones who had paid for the lesson in blood. He never boasted, never sought credit. When officers offered him medals, he turned them down. "I didn't win the war," he said quietly. "I just made it a little shorter." When the war finally ended, the world celebrated. Cities filled with cheers, flags, champagne, and parades. Culin boarded a ship back to America in silence. He carried no souvenirs, only memories of smoke, of sparks, of a sound he'd never forget. The moment steel met earth, and the world changed course. He returned to New Jersey and opened a small garage on the outskirts of town. He fixed engines again, just like before, the simple kind, the kind that took people home instead of sending them away. To his customers, he was just Kurt, the quiet mechanic who never spoke much about the war. Years passed. The rhinoceroses rusted away in European fields, their teeth dull with time. Only a few survived, silent in museums, reminders of a time when imagination was a weapon. In 1963, Curtis Culin passed away in his sleep. No reporters came, no headlines ran, just a folded flag, a few old friends, and the soft rain tapping on the garage roof, the same rhythm that had once followed him through the nights of Normandy. But history never truly forgets. Decades later, his invention would be studied, honored, and displayed, a crude piece of steel that changed the fate of nations. On its plaque, beneath the dust and fingerprints of time, a single line remains: "The mad mechanic who saved D-Day." And maybe he was mad enough to see hope in a heap of scrap metal, mad enough to believe that one man with a welder could turn the tide of war. In a world consumed by destruction, Curtis Culin built something that gave life a reminder that even in humanity's darkest hour, the brightest sparks are forged in the hands of ordinary men.